Hello, friends. Welcome back to Los Vivas week 22. Just drop my Viva. This week's question is a fun one. It is what were the long-term implications of the hippie movement? So, although we tend to think and reduce the hippie movement as just an aesthetic, its ideological implications fundamentally changed America. And it did this through transforming our morality and religion. It changed the way we view it changed our relationship with our body, and it affected our view and advanced our view in technology. So, if we dive into our first point on how the hippie movement really changed and impacted America fundamentally, is through morality and religion. So, this movement sought out new moralities by embracing relativism and deontological ethics. So basically, during this kind of time period, we see everybody kind of has a stable amount of money, and so people are able to kind of embrace and invest in different trends and aesthetics. And also we're allowed to have a teenage class now, because before it was kind of, you're a kid, now you're an adult, you're gonna get married and you're gonna work and you're gonna do this. But now there's like this extra amount of like money and security, and so kids are kind of allowed to be kids for longer, but then also they're kind of growing up, so we get this teenage class, which is unique to this time period so far in history. So that's kind of, we have trends coming up, we have the teenage class coming up, and then we see the aesthetics of the hippie movement kind of go back to the 19th century art, and through using nature and calligraphy and just different designs, like very loopy and flowery designs in their aesthetics. So in the early 20th century, Lebensreform was this social movement in Germany and Switzerland, and they really embraced this back to the earth, back to nature lifestyle. And so like a lot of hippies, or like I guess you would expect, they embraced health foods and sexual liberation and natural medications and the abstention from alcohol, tobacco, drugs, and vaccinations. And so that they did not like those, actually, which is kind of weird because I feel like they would, but they don't. They like back to the earth, back to the natural. So this is kind of rise of modernism, and it's made kind of a back to the land philosophies kind of seem outdated. And we have this rise of modernism because the young people are starting to reject the harsh morality and aesthetic purity. They don't like that. And so I think we learned about this at the beginning of the year, or last year, with the Puritans. And when the Puritan movement kind of fell, we can see this, we saw it through music and different just behaviors in society after that. But how people, when you have like something very strict in morality, such as Puritanism or this Lebensreform, people tend to get, they're sick of it and they feel stuck. And so when this ends or kind of comes down in power, people make up for it, and they kind of go crazy. And so this is how we can kind of see the rise of modernism, through people rejecting the harsh morality and purity and beautiful aesthetics of nature. So we get the rise of science and tech and postmodernism. And postmodernism is basically a response to modernism, but they embrace past traditions and ideas and aesthetics and movements, and they so they really embrace like all this past stuff. And we also have this computer age, though, and you can go and read this really complicated quote and highlight, annotate, and sticky note it to understand it, but it basically tells us that computers transform knowledge into information, and they do this because our minds can connect like facts and put them into context, but computers can't do that. And so when people are starting to use computers for the first time during this age, and different technologies, they're not getting the full story. They're just getting bits and pieces of information and facts versus knowledge and context and wisdom. So this leads to the idea of multiple moral codes based on culture. And so we can kind of see this, and during this time period, they wanted all of these moral codes to be equal and be respected the same amount, even though a lot of them contradicted each other. Like, some cultures might say, yeah, it's, okay to have more than one wife, and other cultures might be like, no, you have to have one wife, or other cultures might say, no, your parents choose your wife, or whatever. So there's like these different conflicting views on things, but then we all have to hold them up equally because all cultures are equal, and it creates this really like complex moral code system based on cultures, because people don't realize that there's such thing as context, or I guess they're forgetting about it, and so they're just looking at the information versus knowledge. And so we get the embrace of that and just relativism at its finest. And then we get this birth of Rawlsianism. And so a man named John Rawls, he lived from 1921 to 2002, and he is one of the most important modern philosophers. One of his intellectual rivals actually says, quote, political philosophers must work within Rawls' conceptual framework to explain why they don't, end quote. So yeah, he's just this really important modern philosopher that we know a lot about and learn a lot about how the modern world works. So he came up with this, is it a theory? He came up with Rawlsianism because he believed in Christianity, and he thought Christianity was really good, but he believed that it did not have enough rules for people to follow. So he added on to the Bible. That's not gonna go wrong, John. So he had basically kind of two main points. One was the veil of ignorance, and that was kind of where you look at a situation objectively. And then, so, obviously you're not in the situation, you're looking at it from an objective point of view. And then the other is original position, where people know nothing about themselves. So you can't, you don't have your experiences or context in a sense, but you just are able to look at the principle of justice. And so if you, the idea is, if you don't know who you are, or you're looking at it from objectively, then you're able to make the just decision. So for an example, if you think of an immorally hard situation in your mind. Like, one that came to my mind was stealing bread for your starving family. So, you know, would you rather have your family starve, or would you rather steal bread? So if you looked at this from objective point of view, and then you also did not have a connection with yourself, so you weren't like the father of the family, you know, like, you just have to decide like what is just, and whatever you choose, or whatever most people choose, is the right decision. So we see a lot of communities and individuals kind of come up here through the Rawls beliefs and through just this coming of age, rejecting morality kind of thing. We get these communities which make people obey certain laws, like communal living, which became really popular during this time period. But then we also have, you know, the hippie movement itself really embraces the find yourself, you're an individual, you do you kind of mentality, meditation, stuff like that. So we see this kind of like interesting like community, unified communal living with individuality, and I'm my own person and I will find my own truth and stuff like that. Individual journey, Siddhartha. So anyways, hippie ideals come into evangelical Christianity. And we can see this through kind of the hippie movement embraces good and evil, and they live like a happy life, and they have universal spirituality and versus religious thought. And then Christians kind of, you know, extend music performances and rely on technology and electronics for their services, and have informal language and clothing, and so it's more like chill. And so these both kind of affect each other, and we get Jesus people, which are super cool, and they are like hippie Christians. And so there was a movement called the Jesus people. We should bring it back, guys. I'm not gonna make that joke. Okay, whatever. Moving on to point 2 on how the hippie movement really fundamentally changed America is through the way they looked at our relationship with our body. So the hippie movement creates this interest in drugs, which is probably the most common thing people think of when they think of the hippie movement, is drugs like marijuana and LSD. And they also have alternative perspectives on healthcare, exercise, and the relationship between our bodies and the environment. So carpe diem, everybody. Carpe diem, seize the day. This is a major mentality, major vibe of the hippies, seizing the day. And seizing the day led to drugs. American psychologist who was a really big advocate for psychedelic drugs was Timothy Lear, and you can watch his video in the slides. He's very, he's a great speaker. No, he's not. But his like famous quote is, turn on, tune in, drop out. And so he's just like really chill and like, yeah, boy. And so he's just like, you know, take those drugs, tune in, be like, what is up? And then just drop out and go to get high. So LSD, so that was kind of like marijuana, psychedelic drugs. And again, it kind of just leads to this carpe diem vibe of bringing kind of like heaven to here, because we're not waiting, we're bringing it now. There's somebody walking out my window. It's probably like, she's high. And I'll be like, peace out. Okay, whatever. He probably heard that. Okay, whatever. So anyways, LSD leads some people to hallucinations, beautiful visions of perfection, profound insights into their past, and also it also leads to more suicides because people are just more like, look at the ground, and then they like jump out a window. So great drug, but also not great drug. It has some serious side effects. So anyways, LSD, weed become a really big thing during this time period. And we get this personal choice ideology for medications, which becomes a big thing during this time period. And this kind of goes towards the crystals, to yoga, to herbal medications, to essential oils. And people were just really about embracing what you do, you basically. You know, what medications work best for you and what you want to do with it. Wish we had that today. We better have that today. So yeah, so that was kind of personal choice, drugs, partying. Our relationship with our bodies is your choice. We also get this individualism and hippie emphasis on identity, which leads to a lot of loneliness and social isolation. Just because a lot of people sometimes don't know what their identity is, and also just being individual is lonely. So leads to a lot of sadness. So what unites us in a relativistic realism moral universe? And the answers are egalitarianism, which is that all people have equal rights and opportunities, and then self-realization, which is the fulfillment of one's full potential. So these are the two things that kind of make people really unite under the different things of the day. William Rarbrough says, quote, although hippies often disagreed about beliefs and practices, they shared a desire to be authentic. Authenticity means doing your own thing, girl. This was exploratory and chaotic. At the same time, personal autonomy created loneliness and isolation, end quote. So again, if you don't have like a specific way of doing things and it's all about doing you, it becomes complicated and kind of scary, and nobody knows how to help you because you're doing your own thing and there's no formula. So it becomes chaotic, lonely, but also a good time to be individualism and confidence. So it's a crazy time. Another way we really see how the hippie movement affects our bodies is through their food and their promotion of certain foods. So we know from World War I or II, I think it was I, we get a lot of processed foods and canned foods and bad foods for you because they needed to give them to the soldiers. And so this is basically rejected during the hippie movement. Jonathan Kaufman's book, Hippie Food, How Back to the Landers Long Chairs Revolutionaries Changed the Way to Eat. So they really argue that hippies movement was responsible for the rise of organic agriculture and whole wheat bread. And then we have the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which was during the late 1800s, so it was a little bit before the hippie movement. But they they really pushed people towards vegetarianism, which led to a lot of the hippie movement stuff. And so then we have, you know, people taking Japanese food and using it for their own, for like making it American food. And we have Ben and Jerry's ice cream, which have a lot of ideals of the hippie movement, and they support, you know, same-sex marriage. Bernie Sanders 2024 kids And from the 1960s, I laughed so hard when I read that. You know, they also created Whole Foods, the slow food movement, which was kind of a alternative to fast food and something that really like promoted local foods and agriculture and cooking at home, traditional cooking. And okay, my phone's on low power, so I'm gonna have to hurry up. So yeah, hippie movement had a big impact on how we view our bodies, what we put in our bodies, like drugs and food. Third and final point is how the hippie movement really impacted the view of technology. And so, although hippies were really rooted in this traditionalist, back to nature, the young people of the 60s led to an interest in using tech to improve life. And it included moleculars, architectural structure, and personal computers. So, I think we talked about this a little bit before, about how the hippie movement kind of was this like traditional, back to earth, aesthetic, traditional stuff like that. But then they also were like technology, advancement, drugs. So it's like a weird time period. Like they're really two extremes that were like hippie. So whatever. So 1960s led to a new way of thinking, which led to a new way of living in communities, which led to this idea of utopianism. And so when you think of a utopia, you can think of a dome because it's protecting everybody from evil. And so this leads to domes like Epcot in Disney World. A lot of people start living in suburbs and kind of living off the land, building their own houses. So there were actually like little pamphlets that you could buy that were literally like little pamphlets that just would be like how to build your dome house. And so people were building dome houses. Another kind of technology thing which is kind of cool is phone fracking. So before we had the wireless phone systems, phones were simply kind of connected to a tone system. So, you know, if you hit the buttons, it would be like ding, 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 you know, like the different numbers or whatever. So people were able to kind of learn the different tones of the numbers, and then they were able to like whistle the tone or like do the tone in the phone versus hit the buttons. So they would get phone calls for free. Really cool. It's a fracker. Become a fracker, guys. But this was illegal technology, which again, this kind of led to DIY communities, which led to the personal computer, which is a big thing during this time period. So hacker was actually first used in 1963. Fracker, hacker. So yeah, so this is just like super kind of cool that people were able to like kind of like take a deeper look into what is actually inside of a computer versus just like look at the screen. Another kind of cool thing is that the blue unicorn came up in, I didn't write down. Well, it was created by Ron and Jay Thinell, and they opened it as a psychedelic shop to buy LSD, and then it kind of became this first coffee shop. And so we get our fancy drinks, our fancy Starbucks drinks and Dunkin' drinks, and it also kind of like is a part of a fracking stuff. And so, but it becomes the first coffee shop, so we can thank the hippies for our coffee too. Fundamentally changed America, guys. Coffee and fracking and drugs. So yeah. So basically, and then we also have this Whole Earth catalog, which is super influential in technology. And it wasn't so much a book as it was a network. So it kind of just had information that could be shared to like-minded people, and it was easy for like-minded people to get the same information versus really leaping over barriers like, you know, far away, distance, race, class, gender, didn't matter, because you were able to be shared by this information through this catalog. Steve Jobs actually says, quote, "The whole Earth catalog was one of the Bibles of my generations," end quote. And so again, this was a book, but it was like really, like, it was a way of connecting great minds to come up with different ideas and just keep everyone up on the network and information. So Apple, we also see this kind of hippie movement going through Apple computers, Apple records. So again, Steve Jobs kind of comes out of this time period, and so does Microsoft, Bill Gates. But actually, Chris Hauer kind of talks about how the hippie movement is this time where people had open sourced like an open source movement and sharing of ideas. And so we can see this in the Apple sign of Apple products, and then we also see it in the Apple records, which the Beatles used. Yeah, so it's kind of cool that they kind of not copied each other but shared their ideas. And then Steve Jobs was a big hippie guy. He actually says, quote, "I have no words to explain the effect that LSD had on me, although I can say it was a positive, life-changing experience for me, and I am glad I went through that experience," end quote. So, founder of Apple, he was an LSD guy, hippie guy, and he lived in the 1960s, and that's when his ideas started to come to him through the cool catalog, One Earth catalog, and stuff like that. So, crazy time period, guys. And although we tend to reduce the hippie movement down to just the aesthetics of it, as we kind of learn today, its ideological implications fundamentally changed America, and it transformed the way we think about morality and religion, the way we think about our relationship with our bodies, and our view of technology. That's this week. See you guys later. Peace out.